Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Chapter 5.
Amongst the interior causes that threaten England with decline, none is more alarming than the increasing expenses of the poor. Expenses evidently rising in a proportion beyond our prosperity, and totally without example, either in the history of past times or in that of any modern nation. The poor of England cost more to maintain than the free revenue of the country amounted to 30 years ago, and to nearly 3 times the amount of the whole revenues of the nation at the time of the Revolution. The proportion between the healthy and the sick cannot have changed so much as to account for this augmentation. We must, therefore, seek for the cause elsewhere. It probably arises from several causes. The increasing luxury, which leaves more persons in indigence when they come to an advanced age, owing to their being unwilling or unable to undergo the hardships to which nature subjects those who have been born to labor and outlive their vigor, being thereby deprived of those indulgences which in better days they have experienced. In England, menial servants are accustomed to consume more than people of moderate fortune do in other countries, and they are the race of people most likely to be left to penury in their old age. In countries where there are indeed greater trains of menial attendants than in England, they, in general, belong to the great, who make some provision for them, or who, keeping them from ostentation, can retain them to a more advanced age. And at all events, as they live a less luxurious life, they can make a better stand against that penury which it is their hard destiny to encounter. In a commercial country, there is less attachment between master and servant than in any other, and the instances of provision for them are very rare. In proportion as a nation gets wealthy, the human race shares the same fate with other animals employed in labor. They are worked hard and well fed while they are able to work, but their services are not regarded when they can do but little. Want of economy in the management of the funds destined for the purpose of their maintenance is another cause of increase in the expense of the poor. In a nation where every individual is fully occupied with his affairs and has little time to attend to anything else, those who manage the affairs of the poor find that few are inclined to look close into matters, and fewer still have the means of doing it if they would, so that abuses increase, as is always the case when there is no counteracting check to keep them within bounds. Another cause, no doubt, is that as the number of unproductive laborers increase, greater numbers of children are left in want. To all those causes, we must add the increase of towns and the decrease of hamlets and villages. Towns are the places where indigence has the greatest consolation, and where the relief which is held out is attended with the least degree of humiliation and reproach. When we compare the cases of England and Scotland, the causes cannot be doubted. For there, servants live harder, the working class do not labor so hard and are not so soon worn out, neither have the towns increased so much at the expense of the hamlets and villages. The greatest of all the causes of the increase of poor, however, arises from taxation and rent. It has been observed in the chapter on taxation that for a certain length taxes and rent are productive of industry, and that at last they finish by crushing it entirely. The manner that this happens is that long before a country is as highly taxed as the majority of its inhabitants will bear, those who are the least able to pay are crushed and reduced to absolute poverty. There are 2 causes which may render a person unable to support the burden of taxation. The one is having a great family, the other is being able to gain but little from weakness or some other cause, and, where there are 2 causes that tend to produce the same effect, though they operate separately, they must, of course, sometimes act in conjunction. The weakest part of society gives way first in every country, and on account of the arbitrary and ignorant, though lavish method of relieving that portion of society, in England, the evil is increased to more than double. There is no relief at home in their own houses, no help, no aid for the indigent, which might produce so admirable an effect by counteracting the ruin brought on by heavy taxes and high prices. No, the family must support itself or go wholesale to the workhouse. This is one of those clumsy, rude modes of proceeding that a wealthy people, not overburdened with knowledge, naturally takes to overcome a difficulty, but without care or tenderness for the feelings of those relieved, or that regard for public interest, which ought to go hand in hand. For this, it would be well to search a remedy. A father and mother and 6 children will cost at least £50 a year in a workhouse, but perhaps the aid of £12 or £15 would keep them from going there, and by that means save the greatest part of the money, while the country, which loses their industry, would be doubly a gainer. There is a sort of rough, vulgar, and unfeeling character prevalent amongst the parish officers that is a disgrace to the country and to the character of Englishmen. It is highly prejudicial to the nation, and if there were no moral evil attending it, if the feelings of the poor were no object, the rich ought to attend to it for self-interest. If they will not, the government of the country is interested, both in honor and in interest, to do so. Exemption from taxes will do little or nothing. The lower orders are nearly all exempt. But that general dearness, that is the consequence of a general weight of taxes, is severely felt by them, and from that they cannot be exempted. They must get relief by assistance, and that assistance ought to be given in a manner that will not throw them altogether a burthen on the public. It is impossible to tax the people of a nation so highly as they can all bear, because, before some will feel, others will be crushed. Before the bachelor feels the tax, the father of a large family is obliged to starve his innocent offspring. Before he who has only 2 children feels the hard pressure, the family of 12 will be reduced to want, and so in proportion. The mode, then, to raise the most money possible would be to tax the whole nearly as high as the bachelor can bear, and then to give a drawback in favor of the man with the children. They would then be on a perfect equality as to taxation, and the highest sum possible might be raised without hurting any one portion of the people more than another. If the links of a chain are not all equally strong, before any strain is felt by the strong links, the weak ones give way, and the chain is broken. The case is the same with the members of a community. Now, when you lay on taxes, the general tendency is to raise the price of food and labor. Most laborers receive the advantage of the price of labor, but many pay unequally for the rise of food. A tax on the wealthy, it will be said, is the thing proposed. But no, that would do nothing. It must be a premium or drawback to men with families who are poor, not merely to counteract the effect of any one tax, but the total effect of taxation with respect to maintaining their children. Wide indeed is the difference between a tax on those who are well able to pay and a premium or drawback in favor of those who are not. The manner of providing for the poor in England leads to a degree of wastefulness and improvidence unknown in any other country. Improvidence ought as much as possible to be discouraged, for with those who labor hard and are indigent, the desire to gratify some pressing want or present appetite is continually uppermost. This may be termed the war between the belly and the back, in which the former is generally the conqueror. It would be a small evil if this victory were decided seldom, as in other countries. But in the great towns of England there is, as it were, a continual state of hostility. In London, the battle is fought on an average at least once a week, and idleness and the profits of those sort of petty usurers, called pawnbrokers, are greatly promoted by it. Some part of this evil cannot perhaps be remedied, but there are certain articles that ought not to be taken in pledge, such as the clothes of young children and working tools. There is no doubt but that, in a populous, inhospitable trading town, where there is no means of obtaining aid from friendship, where the want is sometimes extreme, the resource of pledging is a necessary one. This is to be admitted in the degree, but by no means without limitation, for the facility creates the want, even when it is a real want, for it brings on improvidence and carelessness. The lower classes come to consider their apparel as money, only that it requires changing before it is quite current. If this matter were well looked into, together with the other causes from which mendicity proceeds, which increases so rapidly, we should soon perceive a diminution of the poor's rates, and the wealthiest country of Europe would not exhibit the greatest and most multiplied scenes of misery and distress. the numbers of children left in indigence by their parents would be comparatively lower, and there would not be that waste in the administration of the funds on which they are supported. There is probably no means of greatly diminishing the number of helpless poor, but by an encouragement to lay up in the hour of health and abundance to supply the wants of feebleness and age, but this might go a great way to diminishing the evil. All persons who have places under government, of whatever nature, ought to be compelled to subscribe to such institutions. This would be doing the individuals, as well as the community, a real service, and would go a great way to the counteracting of the evil. Preventives are first to be applied, and after those have operated as far as may be, remedies. The poor, etc., to whose maintenance £5.5 million a year goes, a sum greater than the revenues of any second-rate monarchy in Europe, may be divided into three classes. First, those who by proper means might be prevented from wanting aid. Second, those who for various reasons cannot get a living in the regular way, but might, with a little aid, either maintain themselves or nearly so. And third, those who from inability, extreme age, tender youth, or bodily disease are unable to do anything and must be supported at the public expense. Nobody will dispute that there are of all those descriptions maintained at present, and therefore all that can create a difference of opinion is about the proportions between the three. It is probable that one half, at least, could maintain or nearly maintain themselves. One quarter might be prevented from ever requiring any aid at all, and the other quarter would be assisted as at present. This would reduce the expenses to less than 1/3, and probably to 1/4 of what they are now. That is, of £5.5 million, there would be a saving of £3.5 million. But that is not all, for the national industry would be augmented by £2 million and more. That is to say, by the industry of the half that maintained themselves, so that the nation would gain partly in money saved and partly in money got, £5.5 million. According to the true spirit of the English nation, in which there is a great fund of generosity and goodness at the bottom, it may perhaps be said that the poor are not able to labor at all, and that the plan would not answer. This is but a rough manner of answering a proposal, which neither is in reality, nor is meant to be, void of humanity. There were, by last year's accounts, nearly 900,000 persons of one sort and another maintained or relieved, which does not make above £6 a year for each person. Now, where is there a person that can work at all, that cannot earn above 4 pence a day in England? The plan for remedying this abuse ought to be very simple, for it will be administered by such ignorant and rough directors that, if it is not simple, it must fail entirely. To have a good surgeon or physician is essential, and those who would not work, and who were able, should have the same allowance that a prisoner has in a jail, but those who would work should be paid a fair price, and allowed to lay out the money, to hoard it, or do as they please, except drinking to excess. Though many for want of vigor are refused employment in a workshop, some for want of character, and others for various reasons, become burthensome. Yet there are not a few who, from mere laziness, throw themselves upon the parish, where they live a careless life, free from hunger, cold, and labor. When the mind is once reconciled to this situation, the temptation is considerable, and there are many of those poor people who will boast that they have themselves been overseers, and paid their share to the expenses. Whatever evil is found to have a tendency to increase with the wealth of a nation ought, most carefully, to be kept under, and this is one not of the least formidable, and of all others, most evidently arising from bad management and want of attention. It would be necessary to have all sorts of employment, that the persons in such places can, with advantage, be occupied in doing, and a small allowance should be made to defray general expenses, amongst which ought to be that of surveyors of districts, who should, like those employed by the excise office, inspect into the state of the different poorhouses, and the whole should be reported, in a proper and regular manner, to the government of the country, from time to time. Those little paltry parish democracies that tax one part of the people and maltreat the other ought to be under some proper control, and the happiness and prosperity of England should not be left at their mercy. In a country where everything is done with such admirable accuracy in the revenue department as England, it would be useless to attempt pointing out the manner of executing the plan. It is sufficient to show its practicability and the necessity of attending to it. If, in the first instance, the advantage would be such as is here mentioned, it would, in a few years, be much greater, particularly in so far as fewer families would be left in a state of indigence. For it is clear that such families are a continual encumbrance on the rising generation and tend to the diminution of the general mass of useful citizens. If it should so happen that taxes augment or that trade falls off, both of which may very likely happen, then the interference of government may become a matter of absolute necessity. But then, perhaps, it may be too late. It would be much better if government would interfere before the evil is actually come to the highest pitch. The parishes might perhaps look with jealousy on an interference of this sort as being an infringement on their rights, for Englishmen are sometimes very tenacious of privileges that are highly pernicious to themselves. This difficulty, for it probably would be one, might be got over by previously establishing inspectors in the different bishops' sees, who should be obliged to render an account to the bishop, to be communicated to government, by which means the evil would either be removed or its existence ascertained, so as to answer the complaints that might be made, and thereby prevent all discontent on the subject. Without being able to say what might absolutely be the best remedy, it is, at least, fair to ask the question whether it is fit that the administration of £5.5 million a year should be entrusted to the hands of ignorant men. It may likewise be asked if the feelings of the necessitous ranks of society, as keen in many instances as those of their betters, should be wounded by men who have not sufficient knowledge of any sort to act with the humanity necessary. The candidates for popular favor amongst the lower housekeepers are generally flattering, fawning, cringing men, and such are almost without exception cunning, ignorant, and overbearing wherever they have the least authority over others. Such, in general, are the parish officers to whose care this important affair is committed. Though this is an institution almost on the purely democratic principle of equal representation, it is a very bad specimen of that mode of government. The shameful lawsuits between parishes about paupers, the disgraceful and barbarous treatment of women who have been betrayed and abandoned, admit of no excuse. They are not productive even of gain or economy. Amongst some tribes of savage Indians, the aged and helpless are put to death, that they may not remain a burthen on those who are able and in health. And it is equally true that, in England, the young innocents who have not parents to protect them are considered as a burthen. And if they are not absolutely sent out of the world, the means necessary to preserve them in it are very inadequate to the purpose. If criminality could be engraved on a graduated scale, their deaths ought in general to be written down at some intermediate point between accidental homicide and willful murder. The persecution of this unfortunate race may be said to commence before they are born. And though the strength of a nation depends much on its population, less care is taken to encourage it than to produce mushrooms or to preserve hares and partridges.
Chapter 6.
In addition to the causes of decline which Britain, as a wealthy country, has, in common with most other nations, it has some peculiar to itself, or of which the degree at least is peculiar to it. The national debt, the high rate of taxation, the prodigious expense of the poor, and the nature of the government are peculiar to this country. There are other circumstances in its favor, of which we shall speak in the next chapter, but in this we shall review those that are against it and of an unfavorable nature and operation. The high rate of taxation, for the very reason that it is the highest ever known, inspires our enemies with hopes of our downfall, and makes them persevere in continuing to put us to expense. The unprecedented commerce we enjoy, of which every other nation would wish to have a share, and of which each, most mistakenly, thinks it would have a share if Britain was undone, is a cause of attracting envy and enmity, and repelling friendship. Our colonies in the West and our possessions in the East act like the conductors that draw the electric fluid to a building, but they do not, like those conductors, serve to protect it from violence. We have seen that the advantage arising from them is more than doubtful, that they enrich individuals and impoverish the state, but all this would be nothing new, were it not for the vast scale on which those evils exist. The poor's rate, which is in itself completely unexampled, though a common thing to all nations, is so exorbitant in England that it may very properly be ranked amongst the dangers peculiar to this country. Who would believe that Frederick the Great of Prussia carried on his brilliant and successful wars against the most formidable enemies, expended more than 1/8 of his revenues annually on the encouragement of industry, and left his treasury well stored? Yet all this with an income less by 1/4 than the sums that go to support the poor in England, notwithstanding all the miserable maneuvers that are practiced to avoid giving them assistance. The form of government in England, though best for the liberty of the subject and for the security of persons and property, is deficient in the means of repressing those infringements which particular bodies of people make upon the community at large. The representative system, when well understood, divides itself into parties having different interests. There are the commercial, the landed, the East India, the West India, and the law, all of which have great parliamentary influence and can be formidable to any minister. They therefore have a means of defending their interests, and they are concerned so deeply as to take a very active part whenever any questions are agitated relative to them. The landed interest and the law are, indeed, the only ones that have any great party in the House of Peers. But then the House of Peers seldom interferes in matters that concern the interests of the others. The Lords seem not to think it their province, and in general, more through diffidence than negligence, they avoid meddling, though, to do that honorable House justice. To it we owe much. Many bills of a dangerous tendency have been thrown out by it after they had passed the other House, and it has been generally done with a wisdom, magnanimity, and moderation, which is only to be accounted for by a true love of the country and an upright intention. In every assembly, a small number who completely understand their own interest can do a great deal if they will act together. But this is not all. They can use arguments with a minister that pave the way for obtaining the ends they have in view, while the general interests of the country alarm no one but upon great occasions. Under arbitrary monarchs, all bodies with separate interests are kept in due order. They have no means of defending themselves but by remonstrance, which, against power, is but a very inadequate protection. There is nothing forced or chimerical in this statement of the case, and the consequence is that no country ever saw any bodies rise to such a height, except the clergy in Roman Catholic countries, and the barons during the feudal system, when they had arms in their hands, who, if they could not absolutely resist their sovereign, were at least able to refuse him aid, and could annoy him greatly. But those examples will bear no comparison with the separate interests in England at this time. The barons have long lost their power, and the Roman Catholic clergy have lost the greatest part of their power and revenue also. If they had not, wealthy and powerful kingdoms would not have existed. Under a free government, where people think that an opposition to a minister in Parliament is a most excellent thing, the energies of the nation as to war are greatly lessened. This must, in its connections with other nations, produce very hurtful effects, but where the evil is without a remedy, there is no advantage in dwelling upon it, and it does not appear that there is any possibility of separating from a free government some sort of an opposing power that must hamper the executive and lessen the energies of the nation. Under pure monarchies, kings can reward merit. They can encourage talents and act according to circumstances. In England, the king or his ministers have no fund from which they can do this. An application to Parliament is expensive and troublesome, and, in many cases, where the object would be fair, it would be unattainable. But this is not all, for when, by Act of Parliament, anything of the sort is once done, it is left without proper control, and the expense is generally double what it ought to be. On the whole, there is too little of discretional power in a representative government. Good cannot be done but by rules, which, in many cases, it is impossible to comply with. This is a disadvantage which we labor under and is a sort of drawback on our excellent form of government. But this is not like the opposition in the Senate. It may be got over and merits attention. Such appear to be the disadvantages to which Britain is peculiarly liable, either in toto or in the degree. But on the other hand, she has many circumstances in her favor, if they are properly taken hold of, and indeed some of which the effect will be favorable, whether any particular attention is paid to them or not. To those we shall advert with peculiar pleasure, and hope that they will not be neglected, but that they may afford a means of continuing our career of prosperity on the increasing scale, or that, at least, they may prevent us from sharing the fate of those nations that have gone before.
This concludes today's reading of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.